Ever wondered what would happen if you stayed single in medieval times? Could refusing to marry actually ruin your life during the Middle Ages? Number 5. Social outcasts and legal nightmares. Did you know that being single in the Middle Ages could literally make you a legal nobody? If you think today's dating pressure is bad, medieval singles faced a completely different level of social punishment. In medieval Europe, your entire identity was wrapped up in your family connections. Without a spouse, you existed in a strange limbo, where society didn't quite know what to do with you. Single women were particularly vulnerable, often lacking legal standing to sign contracts, own property, or conduct business independently. They couldn't participate in guild activities that regulated most professions, leaving them with few legitimate ways to support themselves. For men, being unmarried meant constantly facing suspicion. Why wasn't this man fulfilling his duty to procreate and contribute to society? What moral failings must he have that no woman would join with him? Unmarried men were often barred from certain positions of authority or responsibility because they weren't seen as fully mature adults without a wife to complete them. The legal systems across medieval Europe were fundamentally designed around family units. Kings, lords, and the church all required stable families as the basic building blocks of society. Marriage was the foundation of property, transfer, inheritance, and social order. Those who remained outside this system found themselves without the legal protections and social networks that married people took for granted. In many medieval towns, unmarried adults paid higher taxes, faced stricter curfews, and even had restrictions on where they could live. Some municipalities had special bachelor taxes specifically designed to punish those who remained single too long. These weren't gentle nudges toward matrimony. They were punitive measures meant to force people into marriage. The term spinster originated in this period, initially just describing a woman who spun wool for a living, one of the few acceptable occupations for unmarried women. But it quickly developed into the derogatory label we still recognize today. By remaining unmarried, women risked becoming permanent social outsiders, with diminishing prospects with each passing year. Number 4. Religious persecution and moral suspicion. Would you believe that your romantic status could determine whether you were seen as godly or demonic? In medieval times, the church had frighteningly specific ideas about who was morally suspect, and singles often topped the list. The medieval church viewed marriage as a sacred institution, ordained by God. While virginity was technically praised as the highest spiritual state, particularly for women entering religious life, ordinary people were generally expected to marry. Those who didn't were frequently viewed with suspicion, and sometimes outright hostility. For women, this suspicion could take a deadly turn. An unmarried woman living alone, particularly one with knowledge of herbal remedies or midwifery, often became the target of witch accusations. Without the social protection of a husband, these women were vulnerable to community paranoia. Many of the estimated 40 to 60 people executed for witchcraft across Europe between 1400 to 1700 were unmarried women living independently. The church's stance was complicated. While priests themselves were celibate, this was considered a special calling. For ordinary people, marriage was seen as the appropriate channel for sexual desires. Those who remained unmarried but weren't in religious orders were suspected of engaging in immoral behavior. Prostitution, homosexuality, or other deviant practices were commonly associated with unmarried people, whether evidence existed or not. Medieval sermons frequently warned about the moral dangers of the unmarried state. Preachers describe how the devil particularly targeted singles, using their presumed loneliness and sexual frustration as pathways to sin. single men were characterized as prone to gambling, drinking, and visiting prostitutes. Single women were portrayed as potential temptresses, home wreckers, or worse, practitioners of dark magic. Confession records from the period show that priests often interrogated unmarried adults more thoroughly about potential sexual sins, assuming that without marriage, they must be finding other outlets for their desires. This constant moral scrutiny created an atmosphere where singles lived under perpetual suspicion, their every friendship and interaction potentially subject to malicious gossip. The religious persecution of singles wasn't just about social control. It reflected genuine medieval beliefs about cosmic order. In a worldview where everything had its proper place and role, those who existed outside the normal categories represented disorder and potential danger to the community. Number 3. Economic hardship and survival struggles. Have you ever considered how you'd survive financially without any safety net whatsoever? For medieval singles, the economic equation was brutally simple. No spouse often meant no security. In an era before welfare systems, retirement funds, or health insurance, marriage was the primary social security system. Couples pooled labor, resources, and family connections to create economic stability. Without this partnership, single people faced daunting economic challenges that could make daily survival precarious. For women, the economic consequences of remaining unmarried were particularly severe. Most high-paying trades and professions were closed to them, leaving only low-wage options like domestic service, laundering, or textile work. A single woman might earn just a third to half of what a man made for similar labor. Without a husband's income, many single women lived in perpetual poverty, one illness or economic downturn away from complete destitution. Men faced different but equally serious economic pressures. Guild regulations often required that a man be married before advancing to master status in many crafts. Unmarried, journeymen frequently found their careers stalled, unable to establish their own workshops without a wife who could manage the household aspects of the business. In rural areas, a single man without family labor to help work the land might find himself unable to farm effectively, falling into debt, and eventually losing whatever property he had. Housing was another critical challenge. In an era when most homes were designed around family living, single people often had to resort to extremely crowded lodging houses, where privacy was non-existent and theft was common. Others might find themselves constantly moving from one temporary arrangement to another, never establishing the stability that married householders enjoyed. The medieval system of inheritance and property transfer was fundamentally organized around marriage and legitimate children. Without these structures, singles often found themselves cut out of inheritance or unable to accumulate property. Many towns had regulations prohibiting single people from inheriting property or restricting what they could do with land or buildings they already owned. During times of famine or economic hardship, which occurred regularly throughout the Middle Ages, unmarried people were often the first to suffer. When resources became scarce, communities prioritized families with children, seeing them as investments in the future. Singles might be denied access to community grain stores or other emergency resources, or receive smaller allotments based on the assumption that they had only themselves to feed. The economic harshness extended into old age. Without children to care for them, elderly singles faced truly frightening prospects. The lucky few with sufficient resources might secure a place in an almshouse or religious institution, but many ended their lives begging or performing whatever menial labor their aging bodies could manage. Number 2. Health risks and medical neglect. Did people actually die from being single in the Middle Ages? In many cases, the answer is a disturbing yes. The connection between marital status and health outcomes was stark during medieval times. Without a spouse to notice symptoms, provide basic nursing care, or advocate with medical practitioners, single people faced significantly higher health risks than their married counterparts. Medieval medical care, limited as it was by modern standards, operated largely through family networks. A sick person typically received treatment at home, with family members providing round-the-clock care. Without these caretakers, singles who fell ill often received delayed or inadequate treatment. Something as simple as a fever might prove fatal. Without someone to provide water, change bedding, or apply basic remedies. For women, the risks extended to childbirth. Unmarried pregnant women faced both social condemnation and practical medical dangers. Midwives might refuse to attend them or charge exorbitant fees. Without the post-birth recovery period that married women were granted, unmarried mothers often developed infections or complications from returning to work too soon after delivery. Mental health suffered equally among medieval singles. The constant social stigma and isolation took psychological tolls that manifested in physical ailments. Historical records of melancholy and other conditions we might now recognize as depression show higher rates among unmarried adults. Without the emotional support of a spouse, these conditions often went untreated and worsened over time. Singles typically lived in poorer housing with worse sanitation than married households. During the periodic disease outbreaks that ravaged medieval Europe, including the catastrophic Black Death, these living conditions made singles more vulnerable to infection. Communal living arrangements, which many singles resorted to for economic reasons, became death traps during epidemics. The medieval understanding of health was deeply connected to humoral theory, the idea that bodily humors needed to remain in balance. Marriage was seen as essential for balancing these humors, particularly through regular sexual activity. Physicians genuinely believed that long-term celibacy caused physical ailments, including green sickness in women and dangerous heat buildup in men. These weren't just superstitions. They were the medical consensus that determined treatment approaches. For aging singles, health challenges compounded dramatically. Without children or a spouse to provide elder care, many suffered from neglect. Simple age-related conditions that might be manageable with basic assistance often became fatal. Records from medieval hospitals and almshouses show disproportionate numbers of elderly, unmarried people admitted in advanced stages of illness, suggesting they delayed seeking help until their conditions became desperate. Number 1. Violence, widowability, and targeted persecution. Ever wondered who was safest in medieval society? It certainly wasn't singles. Could you defend yourself against an entire community that saw you as expendable? Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of single life in the Middle Ages was the increased vulnerability to violence and persecution. Without the protection of a spouse and extended family network, unmarried people became easy targets for everything from petty harassment to deadly violence. Single women faced particularly horrific risks. Sexual assault was common and rarely prosecuted, especially if the victim was unmarried. Many communities had an unspoken assumption that unmarried women were available in ways that wives and daughters were not. This made simply walking alone dangerous, forcing many single women to restrict their movements or pay for escorts they could ill afford. For men, the dangers came in different forms. Unmarried men were more likely to be pressed into military service during times of conflict, often assigned to the most dangerous fiammenti positions. In daily life, they faced higher risks of robbery and assault, as criminals correctly assumed they had fewer people watching out for their safety or likely to seek justice if they disappeared. During times of social crisis, singles became convenient scapegoats. When crops failed, disease spread, or other disasters struck, communities often looked for someone to blame. Singles already viewed with suspicion frequently became targets. In the chaos following the Black Death, for instance, there were increased attacks on single women accused of poisoning wells or casting spells. The legal system offered little protection. In many European regions, crimes against unmarried people carried lower penalties than the same actions against married victims. Some legal codes explicitly reduced fines or punishments if the victim was single. This created a permission structure that made targeting singles relatively low risk for perpetrators. Housing vulnerability created additional dangers. With limited options, singles often lived in marginal areas of towns and cities, precisely the neighborhoods with highest crime rates and least protection from local authorities. Those who lived alone faced regular break-ins with little recourse, while those in communal housing had few safeguards against abusive co-residents. Perhaps most disturbing was the use of violence as a marriage enforcement mechanism. In many European communities, charivari rituals targeted people who remained unmarried too long. These weren't gentle teasing, but often violent public humiliations. Victims might be dragged from their homes, dunked in ponds or rivers, forced to ride backward on donkeys through town, or subjected to mock trials where their crime was avoiding marriage. The persecution of singles intensified during periods of demographic crisis. After the Black Death reduced Europe's population by a third, remaining unmarried became almost traitorous in the eyes of authorities desperate to rebuild the population. Coercive marriage policies often used violence or threats to force singles into relationships, regardless of consent. Do you still think modern dating pressure is bad? Would you have survived the medieval single life, or would you have rushed to the altar just to avoid these horrific consequences?